Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're one of the millions of people who wakes up, checks the news, and just tries to find some kind of pattern, some logic in what's happening,
It's a dizzying cycle.
it is. Global politics, these trade threats that seem to come out of nowhere, shifting alliances.
Yep.
It's so easy to feel completely overwhelmed. And we know you're particularly interested in current events, military strategy, and of course that really complex dynamic between Canada and the United States.
Which is, I mean, it's getting more frustrating for a lot of people.
It is. And when you look at that relationship right now, you're not just seeing two countries interacting. You're seeing two completely different approaches to power playing out at the same time.
It's a fascinating contrast.
On one side, you have the loud, chaotic political spectacle, the summits that seem like they're about to fall apart, the tariffs that get threatened over social media. The whole show is just dominated by this incredibly disruptive figure, Donald Trump.
A spectacle.
Exactly. But on the other side, there's this much quieter, almost deliberate counter-narrative coming out of Canada. And this strategy is really embodied by a figure who works in ledgers and data, the central banking heavyweight, Mark Carney.
A completely different world.
So that's our mission today. We're going to take a deep dive into these two contrasting stories.
Yeah.
Because I think we often make this critical mistake in modern analysis, right? We mistake volume for consequence.
The loudest voice in the room.
Exactly. We assume that's the one truly shaping the future. But what happens when that usually polite, often kind of passive neighbor to the north, Canada, stops just reacting with fear and starts asserting its own national interest with these really sophisticated, calculated economic tools?
And this isn't just an abstract topic for a think tank. This matters, it matters now for you, the listener, because what we're all witnessing is a fundamental realignment of power.
A realignment? How so?
Well, the old scaffolding of global rules. That predictable diplomacy, the assumption of free trade, the certainty of American leadership, all of that is being, systematically shredded.
It's falling apart.
It is. And when a middle power, a really reliable U.S. ally like Canada, feels like it has to fundamentally change its security strategy, and I'm talking about its economic security strategy, that's a flashing red light. It's an indicator that the whole global operating system is under some severe stress.
So this pivot you're talking about, from just relying on American goodwill to something more proactive.
Proactive economic fortification, that's the term. And it touches directly on your own livelihood, on the stability of core global institutions, and just the basic assumptions we all have about how the Western world is supposed to function.
So we have to look closely at these two forces, chaos from the south, competence from the north, and really figure out what they're actually achieving and whose strategy is, at the end of the day, more resilient.
Exactly. That's the core question.
Okay, let's unpack this chaos side first. You can't look at global events over the past few years without just acknowledging the seismic presence of Donald Trump. Our sources characterize his approach as erratic, forceful, and undeniably magnetic.
He dominates headlines. It's often by design.
It is. But for this deep dive, we need to understand what defines that chaos structurally, beyond just the dramatic headlines we see every night.
Right. It's not just about personality, though that's part of it. It's a fundamental disruption of the norms that have been in place since the end of World War II.
Norms that allowed for a lot of prosperity, particularly for a country like Canada.
Absolutely. His approach isn't about refining the system. It's about taking a sledgehammer to it. For decades, the Western world lived under this set of assumptions that commerce promotes peace, that treaties are binding commitments, and that you settle disputes in conference rooms through careful negotiation.
And he challenges all of those at once.
All of them, simultaneously. And his view of trade is probably the clearest example of this disruption. It's really crucial to understand the economic theory he leans on, which is often called mercantilism.
Mercantilism. Right, that's an older idea, isn't it?
A very old, pre-industrial revolution even. It's a theory that essentially views trade as a zero-sum game.
A zero-sum game, meaning if I gain something, you must lose something.
Oh,
there's no mutual benefit.
Exactly. It just strips away all the complexity, all the idea of mutual benefit that modern global trade is built on. In his view, if America gains $1 in trade, someone else, Canada, Mexico, China, it doesn't matter, has to lose $1.
And that idea, that core principle that for America to win, someone else must lose, as the source puts it, that justifies all these protectionist measures.
It does. It replaces complex economic interdependence with pure transactional conflict. And that's the logic behind things like massive tariffs.
And crucially, he targets the very visible symbols of that conflict, right? When we talk about these trade wars, we always hear about specific, tangible industries that are easy for people to understand.
Like steel.
Steel, which is the raw material for everything,
Right.
and cars, which represent these massive, incredibly complex supply chains and hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs all across North America.
Those targets are very strategic. They're tangible, they're visible for his base, and they also happen to be points of immense interconnectedness with Canada.
I mean, the North American auto industry is a perfect example.
It is. Think about it. A single car part might cross the U.S.-Canada border 5, maybe 6 times during its manufacturing journey. So a sudden, blunt application of a tariff, say, on steel or aluminum, it immediately injects massive cost and risk into that entire finely tuned supply chain.
And these tariffs are often justified under the guise of national security, right? Using things like Section 232 of that old Trade Expansion Act.
Exactly. He's weaponizing a rule that was meant for something else entirely. So that's the structural chaos on the trade front.
So how does that same approach translate into diplomacy and peace negotiations?
Well, the method really mirrors the trade approach. Instead of the slow, careful work of diplomats that build sustainable agreements that can survive changes in government.
He goes for the big personality-driven deals.
That's right. The deals are announced with huge fanfare. You know, the big handshake, the summit photo op. But the sources we looked at note they often unravel as quickly as they are announced.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Because they don't have that institutional grounding.
Precisely. They don't have the necessary sign-off from Congress or the deep alignment of all the bureaucratic agencies. There's no real consensus required to make them last. It's all built on a handshake, not on a foundation.
So that institutional decay is a key point we need to emphasize. He's not just bending the rules, he's challenging the very foundation of the global infrastructure that the U.S. itself spent decades building.
Yes. The U.S. used to champion these institutions as sources of stability. He sees them as constraints on American freedom and power.
And for a country like Canada, that has to be the core realization. The idea that treaties are enduring commitments, not just temporary inconveniences, is, well, it's gone.
It's gone. And for you, the listener, this means that the basic canopy of predictability that you've lived under, the assumption that goods would flow, that prices would be stable, that diplomacy could solve problems, that's now being actively dismantled by the very nation that used to guarantee it.
This isn't just political noise.
No, it's a systemic risk being deliberately injected into the global economy.
Okay, so the disruption is clear. It's systematic. But what are the actual consequences of this chaos? I mean, chaos by its nature creates friction, doesn't it? It can't just steamroll everything unopposed.
It absolutely creates friction. And the friction he encounters is messy, complex reality, a reality that resists simple slogans.
Like those global supply chains we were talking about.
Exactly. They've been carefully calibrated over decades for maximum efficiency. You can't just reroute them because the president signs an executive order. The complexity of moving manufacturing out of Mexico or China is, well, it's enormous. You measure it in years and billions of dollars.
And what about allies?
Well, even allies who are deeply reliant on the U.S., like Canada, they refuse to be completely bullied into submission. And adversaries, as one source noted, they just play the long game. They wait for the chaos to die down and for the administration to change.
So the chaos can often be self-defeating. You see these really ambitious policy goals, whether it's peace in some conflict zone or a huge shift in trade, and they just stumble.
They stumble because they lack institutional memory, bureaucratic support, or just a realistic plan for implementation. They're often undermined by the very institutions they're trying to ignore.
And we see specific examples of this.
We do. If you look at the headlines the sources reference about his latest foray into international peacemaking, it's a classic case. It was marketed as this grand, immediate resolution, but it often ended up delivering a masterclass in confusion.
With foreign leaders publicly rebuffing him.
Right. It proves that personal charisma and pressure, they just can't substitute for substantive diplomatic agreement and the hard work of building consensus.
And then there's the constant threat on the trade front, the renewal of tariff threats. One source called it a blunt instrument wielded with the subtlety of a cudgel.
That's a good way to put it. And those blunt instruments, especially when they're aimed at that integrated North American supply chain, they just shake market confidence. Because markets, above all else, crave predictability.
And when the U.S., which has historically been the global anchor, becomes the main source of instability,
It forces everyone else to frantically search for their own separate anchor. And this stumbling, this inconsistency, that's the crucial opening. While Washington is focused on the tweets and the immediate political firestorm, Canada, which is profoundly exposed to every gust of wind from the south, sees an opportunity to move methodically.
it's the difference between operating by gut instinct and operating by, well, competence.
Calculated, ruthless, long-term competence.
This brings us directly to that counter-narrative and the key figure here, Mark Carney. If Donald Trump represents the populist disruptor, Carney is. He's almost his perfect antithesis.
He is.
Describe him for us, because he's a highly specialized figure, not a household name for everyone.
Well, Carney is a man of ledgers, central banks, and finely tailored suits. He really represents the ultimate globally experienced technocrat. And his professional credentials, I mean, they're staggering and unique. He's been the governor of 2 G7 central banks.
Either of them.
Yes. First, the Bank of Canada, and then, most famously, the Bank of England. His entire career has been spent navigating the high-stakes, hushed corridors of global finance, where a single misplaced adjective in a public statement can literally move global markets by billions of dollars.
So he is not a politician in the retail sense. He's not someone who thrives on rallies and sound bites. He relies on data, analysis, and institutional credibility.
Right. And that contrast with Trump is almost like a perfect political drama. You have the cool, detached logic of the central banker versus the gut instinct and raw disruption of the reality star.
And what's so fascinating is how this technocrat has strategically co-opted the language of the populist movement, specifically nationalism.
Yeah.
But he's repurposed it for a liberal democracy.
Right.
We're hearing the phrase Canada first, but it has a profoundly different meaning.
A different accent and a very different strategic goal than its southern counterpart.
So how is his Canada first different from the American approach? We need to be really precise here.
It is absolutely not isolationism or xenophobia, which, are often the hallmarks of populist nationalism. Instead, the source defines it as a strategic hardening of the Canadian position.
A hardening.
Think of it as a crucial shift in posture, moving from a defensive crouchination, just anxiously waiting to see what America will do next, to a more offensive stance in economic diplomacy.
Yeah.
It's about being prepared to use economic tools to proactively secure your national interests.
So the strategy is moving away from what Carney calls reactive appeasement.
Exactly. Moving away from just adjusting to U.S. demands and moving toward proactive economic fortification. And the core doctrine driving this is just pragmatic realism.
The idea being, if the world is shifting into this era of transactional competition,
Where friendship means less than immediate gain,
then a nation's only real defense is its own domestic economic strength.
its vitality and its ability to weather shocks. That's it. That's the whole game now.
Reactive appeasement. That phrase implies that Canada's traditional posture was just to be the polite, reliable neighbor, hoping for the best, and really relying on that historical assumption that the U.S. would always act benevolently.
Or at least predictably.
Right.
And that's exactly right. That assumption fueled Canadian policy for generations. Canadian life, both civic and economic, was based on this kind of silent bargain. Canada would be the Boy Scout of the international community, uphold all the global rules, and in return, the U.S. would provide the security umbrella and, most importantly, that reliable open market that fueled Canadian prosperity.
But that bargain just failed, didn't it? I mean, the really drawn-out, painful renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA. That was the moment of rupture.
That was the moment. Precisely. Carney's pivot is a sober, evidence-based recognition that relying on American benevolence is a relic of a bygone era. During those USMCA negotiations, Canada was treated not as a trusted ally, but as a transactional adversary. They were forced into really painful concessions.
And that event was the crucible.
It was the intellectual and political crucible that proved the old model was just not sustainable anymore. And that realization forced this profound shift in mindset for a country like Canada. They are learning to wield their own economic leverage. Things like critical resources, institutional stability, technical expertise, with a sharpness that might surprise a lot of people.
So the pressure from Washington has, as the source says, inadvertently forged steel in this polite neighbor.
Yes, it's transformed polite diplomatic difference into resilient self-interest and calculated defense.
So instead of just pleading for the old rules to come back, which they know is futile, he's basically saying, the old integrated world is gone, so let's build a new, stronger, more defensible economic infrastructure that makes Canada Indispensable.
Indispensable. That is the key word. Indispensable, regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office.
So they're moving beyond hoping for American goodwill to...
Say, what? The certainty of Canadian capability. Exactly. And this involves calculated, almost ruthless competence. It means ensuring that their domestic machinery, their economy, their regulations can withstand the economic shockwaves that they now just expect will come from the South, whether it's through tariffs, Buy American provisions, or just general market instability.
Okay, so if the goal is to protect national sovereignty, Carney isn't primarily focused on building more tanks or increasing troop numbers, though that's still relevant.
No.
He's focusing on the economy as the primary battlefield. So we need to talk about where modern power is actually measured and fought over.
Right. In the 20th century, the era of great wars, power was measured in battleships and battalions and nuclear warheads. But the modern battlefield has changed dramatically. The real battlegrounds today are found in the often invisible, intricate plumbing of the global economy.
The rules, the standards, the financial system.
All the things that govern trade and capital. And this is exactly where Carney, as a central banker and global financial regulator, has unparalleled expertise.
So while Trump is focused on these highly visible, easily identifiable symbols like steel, which are great for a rally, Carney is looking at the levers that are subtle, technical, but incredibly powerful.
Incredibly powerful because they operate at the regulatory level.
So what are these key economic levers that Canada is now focusing on as part of this fortification strategy?
Well, our sources detail 3 specific tools that are really central to this new economic defense. They are a bit technical, but we have to explain them clearly because they are the mechanism of this new Canadian power.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we have something called carbon border adjustments, or CBAM. This is a subtle but really potent policy tool. Essentially, it places a tax on imported goods based on the estimated amount of carbon emissions produced during their manufacturing.
Okay, wait, I need to pause you here. How does that turn into an economic defense mechanism against the U.S. or other countries?
It's quite ingenious, actually. If a country like Canada or the European Union has high domestic environmental standards and carbon pricing, their local manufacturers are already paying a higher price to operate cleanly.
Right.
Now, if they allow cheap imports from nations with weak or non-existent climate regulations, their own manufacturers are put at a competitive disadvantage. CBAM levels that playing field. It prevents companies from simply moving their production to places with weaker rules to avoid the costs, a practice that's known as carbon leakage.
So it's like a soft tariff. It acts as a protective trade barrier, but it's justifiable on environmental grounds, which makes it incredibly difficult for other countries, even a hostile U.S. administration, to formally challenge it under global trade rules.
Precisely. It leverages a core Canadian value environmental action and transforms it into a sophisticated economic defense mechanism. Now, one practical difficulty is accurately calculating the embedded carbon in complex products, but the regulatory process is designed to overcome that. It's a powerful deterrent.
Very clever. What's the second lever?
The second is digital service taxes, or DSTs. In the modern economy, so much value is created by these multinational tech giants, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons of the world.
Which are mostly based in places like Silicon Valley?
Exactly. But that value is extracted from users all over the world, including millions in Canada. Traditionally, these companies pay taxes where they're physically incorporated, which is often in low-tax jurisdictions.
Right.
Digital service taxes are a new way of taxing them to make sure these large tech companies pay their fair share in the places where they actually earn their revenue and extract user data. It's a crucial move for national budgets, allowing Canada to regain that tax revenue, but it's also about technological sovereignty.
Controlling the flow of money and data within their own borders. It's a direct response to 20th century tax law just not being able to handle 21st century digital commerce.
That's it exactly. It forces revenue repatriation. And it's a statement that national economic borders still matter, even if the data flowing across them is invisible.
Okay, and the third one?
And finally, we have the strategic control of critical minerals. Canada is incredibly resource-rich. And the global economy, particularly with the urgent transition to green energy and advanced military technology, is desperately reliant on these specific minerals.
Things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements.
All the things you need for batteries, electric vehicles, and high-tech defense manufacturing. By strategically positioning these Canadian assets, Carney's doctrine is basically asserting that Canada will no longer be a price taker in the geopolitical market.
They're realizing what they have.
They're realizing they possess resources, energy stability, and a highly educated workforce that are in desperate global supply, especially as the world tries to reduce its reliance on supply chains dominated by geopolitical rivals, like China.
And for our listener interested in military affairs, that's a huge deal. Securing a stable, local supply chain for critical battery components isn't just economic policy.
It directly impacts the readiness and the cost of your high-tech defense hardware. This leverage allows them to extract concessions and favorable deals. They're turning their inherent national advantages into negotiating weapons.
This comprehensive approach, the carbon adjustments, the digital taxes, the critical minerals, it sounds like a massive updated definition of industrial strategy. That term used to be, well, a dirty word for free market purists in North America.
It was anathema. They saw it as the government picking winners and losers.
So how is Carney redefining it?
He's redefining it as a necessary, pragmatic alignment of public policy and private capital to secure national sovereignty in a fractured world. It's no longer about simple, old-fashioned protectionism. It's being defined as a strategic necessity.
And the overarching goal is to build an economy that is, that word again, indispensable.
Indispensable. It must have the resources, the technologies, the specialized skills that the world, and frankly, the United States, cannot afford to ignore or cut off. And that strategic goal dictates all the policy choices. Aggressive public investment in clean energy, prioritizing domestic research, and changing regulations to actively incentivize keeping capital and specialized jobs inside Canada.
So the success or failure of this really technical approach directly impacts the cost of goods you buy, the security of your job, and the value of the currency in your pocket.
It absolutely is. I mean, the contest we're watching is fundamentally between the visceral gut instinct style of Trump, which relies on sheer market weight and the threat of chaos to force a capitulation,
And the cerebral analytical style of Carney.
which relies on mastering the system's intricate, often boring regulatory rules better than your opponent, and using that technical knowledge to extract long-term advantages.
So this clash is more than just personality. It's a profound stress test for the institutional frameworks of both countries. It's easy to blame one person for the chaos in the U.S., but our sources say that would be intellectually lazy.
It would.
We have to understand how it worked. How did the American system itself allow for this level of singular executive disruption?
Well, the mechanism that allowed a single president to disrupt everything so effectively is the immense concentration of power in the American executive branch. And this power, when it comes to trade and war, has been growing largely unchecked for decades.
So Congress, the body that's meant to regulate commerce and declare war, has, what, just ceded its authority?
Largely, yes. For all sorts of reasons, political expediency, polarization, lack of attention, it has ceded its authority to the executive, and this created a crucial loophole. Specifically, the 1962 Trade Expansion Act allows the president to impose tariffs by decree, often under the guise of national security, Section 232.
So the system basically gave the U.S. president a huge switch they could flip, and Trump simply chose to flip it, repeatedly and capriciously.
That's a perfect way to put it. He drove a truck through that loophole. He weaponized a domestic security mechanism for international trade disputes, often against close allies like Canada. This historical disregard for checks and balances is what sustains the chaos. The American executive is like a massive supertanker built with weak stabilizers. A single, erratic captain can steer it wildly, despite the best efforts of the crew.
Okay, that's the U.S. dysfunction. What about Canada's historical institutional vulnerability? Before Carney, their machinery was optimized for a completely different world, wasn't it?
Completely different. Canada's former vulnerability was what the source terms a complacency born of success. Canadian institutions, its diplomats, trade negotiators, business councils, were all optimized for a world of rules.
Meaning they were great at adjudicating disputes within a global framework.
Exactly. But, as the source notes, they were ill-equipped for a street fight. They operated under the assumption that the logic of mutual benefit would always win out over the immediate passions of nationalism or protectionism.
And now comes the major institutional retrofit. While Washington is consumed by the chaos of the courts in the election cycle, Ottawa has this opportunity to be methodical. How does that systemic overhaul actually look on the ground?
It looks like deliberate surgical re-engineering of the bureaucracy. So instead of waiting passively for a trade dispute to land at the World Trade Organization, they're proactively diversifying their trade partners, negotiating with the EU, with countries in the Asia-Pacific region. They're investing heavily in key strategic industries.
And rewriting the regulations.
And, crucially, rewriting regulations that previously held back domestic innovation or capital investment. Carney is shifting the state's whole approach to the economy itself.
From a referee to a coach.
That's a great analogy. In the old system, the Canadian government acted mainly as a referee, making sure competition was fair. Now, under this new doctrine of fortification, the state is acting as a coach. It's designing the plays, actively introducing incentives to keep capital and specialized jobs at home, and cultivating economic leverage.
Like the aggressive investment in clean energy.
Exactly. Aggressive investment in clean energy infrastructure and matching or countering protectionist policies like the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay, let's make this really concrete. Let's use the example of a CEO deciding where to invest hundreds of millions of dollars for a new plant.
Sure.
In the old world, the decision was simple, right? Build a plant where labor costs are lowest and U.S. market access is easiest. That calculation is now completely different.
It's fraught with political risk, and Carney is trying to fundamentally change the variables on that CEO's spreadsheet. By offering substantial long-term tax incentives for building, say, battery gigafactories or green hydrogen facilities, he's creating a gravitational pull for capital.
So the new calculation the CEO faces is,
The new calculation is, does the ease of being geographically close to the U.S. market outweigh the crippling risk of being hit by a capricious U.S. tariff, or having U.S. funding suddenly withdrawn?
and Carney's strategy is to make the stability and predictability of Canada a premium worth paying for.
Exactly. He's working to make the Canada First logic a mathematical reality for those who allocate global capital. The argument is that the stability of the North outweighs the transactional risk of the South.
So we have the ultimate institutionalist, Carney, trying to use the deep machinery of the state to insulate the country. And we have Trump operating by instinct, ignoring briefing books and institutional memory.
And stumbling because he refuses to acknowledge or respect complexity. That tension is the central narrative. It's a contest between the impulse to destroy or ignore institutions for immediate, headline-grabbing wins, and the imperative to systematically strengthen institutions for long-term national viability.
And for the listener, this means understanding that the stability of your local community, the factory down the road, the price of gasoline, it all relies directly on which of these two approaches proves more resilient.
It does.
Institutions can feel abstract until we remember they're steered by individuals. And these two leaders could not be more different in temperament, communication, and strategy. Let's look closer at Mark Carney, this technocratic elite who's become the face of a fortified Canada.
Well, Carney operates with what the source calls surgical precision. In his world of central banking and high finance, he understands that his credibility, the trust that markets, other central banks, foreign powers put in him, is the ultimate currency.
That's all he has.
It's everything. He relies on cold, hard realism. He's challenging that traditional Canadian assumption that moral superiority, or just being the nice guy, is an adequate substitute for genuine economic leverage. He is, in essence, telling the Canadian public that, well, nice guys finish last if they don't carry a big stick.
But that requires asking the public to accept a genuinely difficult trade-off, doesn't it? Especially in a country that has benefited so much from seamless integration with the U.S. What is he asking the Canadian citizen to give up in the short term?
He's implicitly asking them to accept that the comfort of the old seamless integration with the U.S. economy is gone. That ease of cross-border life, the assumption of open trade and cheap imported goods, that is the past.
So he's asking citizens to trade that ease and maybe lower consumer prices.
For the security of the future. And that is a difficult trade-off that is never without cost. It means accepting that some domestic inefficiencies, maybe some higher prices, may arise as Canada secures its domestic supply chains for critical minerals or energy.
That is a huge political ask. Can a democratic system that's built on consensus and gradualism, can it really stomach that sort of short-term pain for long-term strategic gain?
That is the ultimate test. It requires a level of public education and long-term vision that is incredibly rare in modern rapid-cycle politics. If the pain, the slightly higher price of a consumer good, is immediate, and the benefit national security decades from now is abstract, the political will can easily fracture.
He has to manage that expectation.
He does. He has to manage the expectation that economic fortification will feel like a slight drag on daily life compared to the hyper-efficiency of the old globalized model.
Okay, now let's turn back to Donald Trump, the disruptor par excellence. His chaotic action, as we established, isn't just an accident. It's a core, deliberate feature of his political worldview.
It is entirely deliberate. He views that intricate architecture of international relations, the very system that Carney spent his career maintaining and strengthening, as a self-imposed constraint on American power.
A constraint to be broken.
Exactly. By tearing up treaties, ignoring international norms, insulting allies, he believes he is freeing the United States from these globalist shackles and allowing it to act purely in its own self-interest.
And by creating that vacuum of leadership and instability, he forces countries like Canada to abandon their polite deference.
His chaos is, ironically, the greatest catalyst for Canada's new competence. He has effectively taught the Canadian citizen that they can no longer outsource their economic and geopolitical security to the White House.
It is important, though, to acknowledge that Trump is responding to real grievances. There is a sense among his own electorate people, whose factory jobs evaporated under globalization, that the global system, including agreements like NAFTA, just left them behind.
That's a crucial point of complexity. The grievance is profoundly real. It often stems from decades of deindustrialization and economic instability in specific regions. But, the source notes, the tragedy is that his solution, which involves disruption and institutional breakdown, leaves everyone, including his own core voters who are seeking stability, standing in the ashes.
Because the constant trade uncertainty and instability he causes often undermines the very economic security and investment that his voters crave.
Precisely.
And this leads to that incredible historical irony that ties our two narratives together. By forcing Canada to adopt this sharper, more self-interested posture, Donald Trump may have unintentionally strengthened the very neighbor he sought to dominate.
It's the law of unintended consequences applied to geopolitics. Pressure creates diamonds, but it also forges steel. That polite deference that characterized Canadian diplomacy has calcified into something far more resilient and self-aware.
And the intellectual armor for this new posture is Carney's rhetoric.
Yes, which emphasizes productivity and the strategic use of Canadian resources. It tells the world, and more importantly, it tells the Canadian citizen, that the country is not helpless in the face of giants. They are building a national spine stiffened by necessity.
For our listener, who is keenly interested in current events and military strategy, it's so vital to connect these high-level clashes to their daily reality. We need to go beyond the abstract. Why should anyone who isn't an economist care deeply about carbon adjustments or the intricacies of trade treaties?
Because these maneuvers are not abstract geopolitical failures. They are direct threats to community stability. We call this the filtration downward. Let's look at how this instability impacts your life directly.
Okay.
When a peace initiative stalls, say, in a critical oil-producing region in the Middle East, global instability rises, supply chains fracture, and what happens next? The cost of fuel at your local pump goes up instantly, eroding your purchasing power.
Right. And when a tariff is threatened.
That factory down the road that relies on cross-border trade puts its expansion and hiring plans on hold. When the U.S. introduces a massive subsidy program threatening to lure Canadian manufacturing south, the job security of Canadian workers is immediately questioned. This dysfunction filters down to your kitchen table with frightening speed.
So Carney's argument, and why it resonates, is that the antidote to this daily economic vulnerability is found only in domestic productivity and institutional resilience.
He's reinforcing that connection. If you are economically weak or overly reliant on the goodwill of a chaotic superpower, you have no choice but to accept the terms dictated by the strong. But if you are institutionally and economically strong, you have options, you have leverage.
It's the fundamental realization that economic policy is national security policy in the 21st century.
That realization fundamentally upends the entire context of North American relations that lasted through the Cold War and beyond. For generations, the core assumption was that the U.S.-Canada relationship was immutable. The 49th parallel was a line on a map, not an economic barrier.
And that assumption is gone.
Driven home by the events of the last few years, yes, it's gone.
The sources are very clear that this is different from historical disputes over things like lumber or fishing rights, which were frustrating, but ultimately manageable within a predictable system.
Right.
The current dynamic is described as existential.
It is existential because the very premise of the liberal international order, the idea that rules apply equally to the strong and the weak, that economic partnership trumps nationalism, is being questioned by the U.S. itself. Trump challenges this order by ignoring it and using brute force. Carney challenges the resulting power dynamic by mastering the order's complexities and using the rules that remain to shield the national interest.
So this clash is a comprehensive stress test for our foundational institutions.
It is. They're interacting in ways the original drafters of constitutions and trade agreements could scarcely have imagined. We are witnessing the fragility of the North American idea itself, the idea of a deeply integrated, predictable, and mutually beneficial neighborhood.
And that is the ultimate consequence for the listener. This divergence, this struggle between the structural chaos from the South and the calculated competence being built in the North. It matters because we are witnessing the fraying of the North American idea. The outcome of whether Canada can successfully fortify itself against these economic storms will shape the world your children inherit.
A world that is either marginally more stable and rule-bound because of Canadian resilience, or one governed entirely by transactional chaos.
So we've taken the journey today from the surface noise of the political circus,
Yeah.
the tweets, the tariffs, the dramatic summits, and we've moved into the high-stakes engine room of strategic competition. We've seen how one nation, the U.S. under Trump, relies on sheer market weight and institutional disruption to achieve its goals, and how its neighbor, Canada, under the rigorous analytical guidance of Mark Carney, is attempting to insulate itself through calculated competence, deep technical policy, and a kind of strategic economic nationalism.
And the key realization we hope you take away from this, which is just critical for understanding current events, is this. Economic policy is the new national security policy. The nation's defense in this new era lies in its productivity, its domestic growth, the reliability of its supply chains, and the intellectual rigor of its civil service to master the system's rules. It's a profound shift in how we have to perceive and measure national power.
And the sources noted that to play hardball with a superpower is, well, it's inherently a dangerous game. Carney's strategy requires a highly functioning, agile civil service and a public that's willing to endure some short-term pain for that long-term strategic gain. Remember that difficult trade-off he's demanding.
And this leaves us with the central, provocative question for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Can a system built for consensus and gradualism, a system that has always prized being the polite, friendly neighbor and working within established rules, can it successfully pivot to the strategic, calculated competition required to survive the lightning speed of modern economic warfare?
That is the true test facing Canada.
It is, and its outcome will determine the stability of the entire continent.